You're listening to the Real Life Ostomy Podcast. Welcome to episode 1 of the Real Life Ostomy Podcast. In the beginning, IBS and UC. I'm your host, Jameson Cycz. All right, so this is episode 1. This is where it all begins. So to start the show off right, let me introduce myself. So I already said my name again. I'm Jameson Cycz, and I am an ostomate, and I've been living with an ostomy for nearly 5 years now. And I had struggles with bowel disease, both potentially, and we'll get into that in more detail in a little bit, irritable bowel syndrome, and definitively ulcerative colitis is what I struggled with in terms of bowel disease prior to having an ostomy. One thing that I do want to preface this entire show with, and I may mention this again come future episodes, just so that we're clear, is that I am not a doctor or an ostomy nurse. I'm not really a medical professional in any way. I'm just a guy that has had an ostomy for a few years now and struggled with bowel issues for some years prior to having an ostomy. And I just want to share my experiences with you. So that's what this show is going to be like. It's largely going to be conversational, candid style stories about my experiences. It's meant to be informative, yet also potentially entertaining as well. I don't want it to be terribly boring. I want it to hopefully be something interesting, as well as give information that will be useful. So that's what you can generally expect from this show. Now, before I dive into my main topic, the first thing I want to say is, what is an ostomy? If you don't presently have an ostomy, if you are struggling with any kind of bowel disease or irregular bowel, those kinds of things could potentially lead to an ostomy in the future. And since this show is very distinctly about ostomy living and what it's like to have an ostomy and everything surrounding that, it seems reasonable to say, what is an ostomy? So in a very broad sense, an ostomy is a way of redirecting the bowel, be it the large or small bowel, and then having that bowel surgically placed through the abdominal wall, and it creates what's called a stoma, which is a small end of the small bowel that sticks out from the abdominal wall, and that allows waste to exit. If for some reason you've had a section or an entirety of your bowel removed, say in the entirety of the large bowel or a portion of it, or even more in some cases, this allows you to release your waste. And there are finer types too, which I will touch on in the future. And there are even ostomies that allow the release of urine, so what's called a urostomy. But the other common types are colostomies, which the stoma is created from a portion of the large intestine, the large bowel. And then there are ileostomies, where the stoma is created from a portion of the small bowel, typically the ileum, or the lowest part of the small bowel. But there are other finer types of ostomies as well. So ostomies allow the release of solid or semi-solid waste when some sort of disease or ailment has caused you to need some kind of surgical treatment, in which a typical sit down and go function is not necessarily possible anymore after a surgery. However, several episodes down in the series, I will talk about possibilities for reworking things, but that's jumping ahead quite a bit. So to start off today's episode, our main topic, at least, now that we're getting down to the brass tacks here. This is going to be a largely story-based episode where I'm just going to tell you about the beginnings of not even necessarily ostomy life for me, but the beginnings of bowel issues and the things that led up over some years leading to having an ostomy. So my beginnings with bowel issues, I would say even growing up as a kid, things were not always all that regular, to say. But it wasn't until I was in my 20s, early 20s-ish, that I started to have fairly severe pain and discomfort with my bowels. And my bowel movements became very irregular and rather unpredictable, really. Occasionally there was like maybe a little bit of spotting of blood, but it was often more like a diarrhea and typically a very, very unpredictable bowel movements associated at times with largely moderate, but occasionally fairly severe abdominal pain. And it was pretty inhibiting to daily activity. At the time, I was working largely in the outdoors. And if I was going to be out on a trail, say I was working in outdoor education, if I was going to be out on a trail or leading an activity, something where I wasn't near facilities or I was tied up in a mechanical system, having these issues sort of spring up on me was extremely inconvenient and unpleasant. Oftentimes I'd really be fighting back this urge of like, suddenly like things have gone downhill and I have to find a bathroom, and it's not always exactly available, and I kind of just have to grin and bear it and deal with it and essentially act like nothing is wrong. So it was pretty tough. And it was a very odd thing that I couldn't really quite grasp, sort of what is going on here? What is the issue with my digestion? There was definitely a lot of uncertainty surrounding the whole thing. I had a lot of questions, and eventually, and I will take responsibility for this, it was probably a few months after these signs and these symptoms really sort of showed themselves fairly prominently. It was a few months after that I finally said, all right, this is definitely abnormal, and I need to have this looked at. And at that time in my life, I was not all that great about seeing a doctor regularly if I had some issue. So I did admittedly deal with it for a bit, saying, all right, it's just sort of weird, whatever, maybe it'll pass. And it didn't really pass. So eventually I did see my primary care provider, talk to them about this, gave them the rundown of my symptoms. And essentially what I was told is that I had irritable bowel syndrome, which, especially at that time, was a fairly nebulous, mysterious sort of description of the symptoms. And essentially what I felt like I was being told when I was told that I had irritable bowel syndrome, this IBS, is that IBS was just sort of a weird thing that wasn't well researched, wasn't well known, and that there weren't all that many treatments for it. Now, in 2020 and beyond, that may not be the case as much. I would need to look into it, but I believe I have heard that there are more potential treatments for this irritable bowel. But what's important to know is that irritable bowel and irritable bowel syndrome and inflammatory bowel disease are definitely not the same thing. Inflammatory bowel disease is definitely more serious. That's Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, I believe, classify as inflammatory bowel disease, and I believe there are others. And those are certainly worse. But I was told that I had this irritable bowel syndrome, which they couldn't really do much about. I was just sort of told that I had this weird thing. There's not a lot we can do about it, and essentially just deal with it. And I didn't have a colonoscopy, which, hindsight, I think I probably should have had, just for a little bit better answer, a little bit better diagnosis. But it wasn't recommended that I had a colonoscopy. I didn't even really think of it, and I just sort of took my doctor's word for it, and I said, okay, I have this weird thing, and I guess I just have to deal with it. There's not really anything we can do about it. Just deal with it. It was not satisfactory, but that, it is what it is. So I just went on dealing with it. And this lasted for, several years. I would say it was in 2009 that I really started, having these symptoms, and I just went on with that very irregular uncertainty of digestive issues and occasional pain and discomfort and irregular movements and frequent diarrhea and all these things for probably about 6 years or so. Because it wasn't until 2015, 6 years after initially getting these more pronounced symptoms, that I got sick for real. And it kind of started like a general flare-up of, I've got some abdominal pain, some pretty irregular bowels and movements. But then there was definitely more blood too. And that is definitely a sign for concern. If you are seeing blood in your stool when you have a bowel movement, that's not something to overlook. Now, for me, it's kind of hard to say. I don't really recall really well how often I would see blood in my stool over that 6-year period. It was probably periodically here and there. But I also kind of feel as though I may have been in denial about it, thinking like, it's not that frequent, it's not that much, whatever it is. And I think I just kind of pushed it back, being like, it's not a big deal, it's not serious. But in 2015, I started coming up with these more serious symptoms, and not only was there more blood, but I was going frequently. And for about a week, I would say, call it maybe a handful of days, these symptoms were escalating. And I started to think like, I'm definitely sick. It's not just like, I have some irregular bowel movements and there's a little bit of blood. Not, there's that, but I'm starting to feel sick, and I have more abdominal pain, and I was just really not in a good place. And it was definitely more pronounced than it had ever been previously. So I talked to my doctor again about it. And I said, I really need to have this looked into soon. So as far as I can recall, I got an appointment really as soon as possible. And I think by the time a week or so had gone by of having symptoms, I finally saw my doctor. And I was describing all these symptoms and so on. And they were saying, okay, this really doesn't sound good. We think you should have a colonoscopy. So I said, okay, good, let's do that. And they scheduled me a colonoscopy, but it was a few days out. It was something like 5 or more days away from when I saw my doctor. And, I left the office, I went home, and even that evening, I was thinking, I really, really don't feel well. With these abdominal pains and this frequent going and all of this combined, I was not feeling well. And I was not enthusiastic about waiting several days over a weekend and into the next week just to have this colonoscopy done. So I said, I'm not waiting. This is something that I can't just sit through. I need to have this taken care of in some way, because I just can't wait for this colonoscopy and then potentially wait for the results and so on, and then finally have some action taken. So I believe it was basically just the next day after I had that doctor's appointment that I just up and I drove myself to the hospital. I was well enough to drive myself to the hospital. I actually drove to a hospital that was some 45 minutes or so from my house. So I drove to this hospital, to the ER. I had had enough of it. This thing was getting out of hand. I was very much not feeling well. I was in pain, and I had to have this thing worked out. So that's when I decided I got to go to the hospital. And that's where I'm going to leave this story for now. Ooh, cliffhanger. So that I will pick this up next week, and I will continue on with this story. But that brings me to the last segment of the show. Each episode is going to have, of course, this main topic like I've already gone over, but I'm going to have what I call the front butt tip of the day, which is a segment where I will give some kind of helpful hint or tip or suggestion, generally relating to that day's topic. So, for today's front butt tip of the day, I want to express to you that if you are having some kind of bowel issue, pain, discomfort, whatever it is, don't be complacent with that pain and discomfort, really like I was. I just sort of pushed it aside and said, this will pass, whatever. But seek treatment. Don't let it get you down about going to see your doctor, because these things can get severe. And hopefully, if you're having some kind of issue, it's potentially very treatable. So see your doctor and see what they say. Give them the outline of what your symptoms are. But also, if you are unsatisfied with your diagnosis, if they say, well, there's nothing we can do for you, just deal with it, I would say seek a second opinion. Have a colonoscopy done. Suggest it. See what your doctor says, because that's generally a better way of, at least for some ailments, to get a more definitive answer rather than just kind of going off what the symptoms are, because you may have such and such symptoms and it may be IBS, it may be something else. Personally, for me, I think I ended up having ulcerative colitis all along, which I will get into more in the future about sort of my proper diagnosis. But I strongly suspect that even when I was told that I had irritable bowel, I think it was very plausible that I had ulcerative colitis even those years before. And had I been properly diagnosed, I think I could have been properly treated and potentially even avoided having the ostomy altogether had we caught this thing much earlier. So I do want to impress upon you, don't just be complacent with pain and discomfort and take it as it is and just say, oh, this is just a thing I have and I have to deal with it. And if you're unsatisfied with a diagnosis, seek a second opinion and seek help soon. Don't wait, because these things generally can just get worse if you just leave them to their own devices. So, those are my tips for today. So that'll wrap up episode 1 of the Real Life Ostomy Podcast. There is plenty more to come, so please stick around. These episodes will be coming out each week. I have 10 lined up for season 1, and this is only number 1. So stick around and tune in next week for episode 2 of the Real Life Ostomy Podcast. I'm Jameson Cycz, and thanks for listening. This podcast is a Jameson Cycz production. If you want to learn more about the show, comment, or suggest topics for future shows, please do so at the Real Life Ostomy Podcast Facebook page or at RLO Podcast. Thanks for listening.